The bus has served us well for 100 years. However, as the year 2000 approaches, its future role is the subject of much conjecture. Historically, this has been a conservative industry, working within strict limitations of length, width, height, and weight. For many years, the diverse mix of manufacturers have tried to meet the demands of the equally diverse mix of operators for powerful, higher capacity, cheaper to operate vehicles. How has the British bus and trolleybus evolved during the past 100 years? First, the earliest known film of a horse bus. These had arrived in London in 1829. 70 years later, they were clopping into oblivion all over the country. For the men, life had been tough. 12-hour days, 7 days a week was not uncommon. A bus horse lasted on average 4 to 5 years. The search was on for any cost-effective alternative. At first, the steam or electric tram seemed to provide the answer. As more towns and cities converted, the clatter of hooves, the crack of the whip, and the curses of the harassed bus drivers would no longer reverberate along our streets. If the tram swept in like a conquering hero, the motor bus had a somewhat hesitant beginning. As late as 1908, they were still outnumbered in London 2 to 1 by horse buses. In fact, the manager of the largest horse bus company predicted, somewhat foolishly, in 10 years' time there will not be a motor bus outside of a museum. How wrong he was. By 1914, most horse buses and trams had gone, but a few places still had horse-drawn charabancs and wagonettes. In reality, these were little more than large carts with rows of rake seats. This one is seen in Southport about 1904. A few joggers kept going. This one could be seen in Newcastle until as late as 1931. In more recent years, the occasional preserve vehicle has been trotted out for some special event. For example, this one toured Edinburgh when the city operated its last trams in 1956. This was the first mass-produced bus in Britain. Although slow and uncomfortable, these wooden-bodied London B-type bone shakers, which rode on solid tyres, possessed a dogged reliability. Over 3,000 were built between 1910 and 1919. The bees really earned their spurs during the First World War, when many were sent to French battlefields as troop carriers. One of these, the legendary Old Bill, was subsequently preserved. But the drive was on for more powerful, higher capacity vehicles. However, for years, developments in London were stymied by strict police regulations. Speeds could not exceed 12 miles an hour. Windscreens were outlawed until 1929. So when the heavens opened, the poor driver sheltered behind a kind of tarpaulin which left only his eyes and nose exposed. On the upper deck, passengers struggled with sodden protective covers. Even the use of pneumatic tyres was outlawed until 1928. By the late 20s, virtually all new double-deckers would have totally enclosed top decks. These NS-type vehicles in Birmingham were built by AEC, the firm which also supplied most of London's buses until the 1960s. One of the landmark buses of the 20s was the Leyland Lion, introduced in 1925. The Leyland Titan of 1927 set the standard for bus design for over 40 years, with its lower chassis, more powerful brakes and pneumatic tyres. These developments in design coincided with moves to scrap the tram. "When you bury a tram, mark the spot with a Titan," declared one slogan. And as if rubbing salt into the wounded tram, the Lowbridge 48-seater was sold as the bus for tomorrow, today. The bus was now launched on an unstoppable demolition of most of the country's tram systems. For over 30 years, front-engined, totally enclosed double-deckers became the norm. This Edinburgh Daimler, delivered in 1936, was typical of most pre-war buses. Further developments would see diesel replace petrol and wooden start to give way to metal bodies. This is a Glasgow Albion. Most front-engine single-deckers of the period were restricted to less than 40 seated passengers. By the end of the 30s, operators were able to select from a wide range of chassis and body designs, many of which would outlive their sell-by date owing to the war. A big change came in 1947, when overall width for a bus was increased from 7 foot 6 inches to 8 feet. With many designs, the once familiar exposed radiator was hidden behind a tin or fiberglass front. There were also new full-fronted vehicles. Another advance occurred in 1956, when the length for a two-axle double-decker was extended by 2.5 feet to 30 feet. However, overall shape and design changed dramatically with the appearance of the rear-engine Leyland Atlantean in 1958. On entering service in Wallasey, these 77-seater giants had a driver and 2 conductors, one for each deck. There was also a travelling inspector who herded bemused passengers to the front doors. From the mid-50s onwards, in moves to reduce costs, drivers became responsible for collecting fares, leading to a steady decline in the number of conductors. The bulk of today's double-deckers owe their origins to the Atlantean. These are Bristol VRs, which were built in large numbers from 1966 to 1981. A new range of under-floor-engined, full-fronted single-decker designs appeared after the war. Midland Red was one of the few operators to design and build its own chassis and bodies. In 1950, the overall permitted length for a two-axle single-decker was increased to 30 feet. Maximum permitted lengths were gradually increased during the 70s and 80s. For example, the Leyland National, built by Leyland in cooperation with the National Bus Company from 1972 onwards, was offered in several different lengths up to just over 38 feet. Cheap, easy-to-run minibuses symbolize the competitive, cost-cutting 80s. The classic single-decker made a comeback in 1990 with introduction of the Dennis Dart. To meet current disability legislation, the very latest bus models are of the low-floor design. For environmental reasons, research continues into finding alternatives to the diesel engine. These battery-powered Italian technobuses have been running in Birkenhead since 1998. Back in 1922, the pirates invaded London. These independent buses, often run by ex-servicemen, fought by fair means or foul for passengers on established routes. As the police had no powers to prevent them challenging the virtual monopoly of the General Omnibus Company, the pirates remained active until the formation of London Transport in 1933. This very early colour film shows a bus still in the old General livery. New length, width and weight restrictions were laid down by the 1930 Road Traffic Act. Also in future, all route alterations and fare increases would be subjected to approval by appointed traffic commissioners. Because it was possible to include a higher capacity 30-foot long body, the three-axle chassis enjoyed a short-lived burst of popularity during the 30s. Both double-deck and single-deck versions were produced. AEC built their renowns from 1929 to 1940, most going to London Transport. This was a Leyland Titanic. Leyland only built 8 of its 6-wheeled GNUs. Dating from 1939, they had a front-mounted engine and twin steering front axles. Both HVW 214 and 215 were owned by City Coach Company of Brentwood. Leicester's famous AEC renowns lasted until 1958. Here, Northern Counties bodied number 329 encounters the second Leyland Atlantean prototype in Leighton Buzzard. Now, 6-wheelers have returned. For example, Stagecoach have transferred some Dennis Dragons, complete with Kenyan assembled bodies, from Africa to Manchester. Buses have always played a key role at big sporting occasions, special services being frequently offered at inclusive fairs. Here fans are en route to Aston Villa's ground. The majority of buses in these 1928 scenes are of the AEC NS type. Highly atmospheric goings-on at Leeds. Watch out for Dennis Lances, AEC Regents and Leyland TD1s, ferrying fans to Elland Road. Further action in Leeds, this time at Headingley Cricket Ground, where single-deckers seem to be predominant. An impressive parade of veteran Leyland TD1s owned by Southdown. The Derby has always attracted enormous crowds. On view, some of the country's last buses with open staircases, which finally disappeared in the early 1950s. Occasionally, all this effort simply proved too much for certain old-timers. In Britain, the trolleybus had a relatively short reign of some 60 years, although it was once a familiar sight in over 50 towns and cities. This Garrett S type with row body was filmed in Leeds in 1925. This was one of the country's first two systems, opened in 1911, the other being at Bradford. Destined for Doncaster, this double-decker Garrett was making a test run on the company-owned Mexborough and Swinton system. In just a handful of places, the trolleybus was responsible for all municipal transport, in Ipswich, for example, from 1927 to 1950. Here, some veterans clocked up 25 years of service. From the mid-20s, the vehicles have begun to look less like railless buses or trackless trams. For example, Guy Motors produced this pneumatic-tired trolleybus in 1926. For many undertakings anxious to dispose of their trams, the trolleybus was a godsend. Two of the first big changeovers at Hastings and Wolverhampton came at the end of the 20s. This is Wolverhampton, erstwhile home of Guy Motors. Guy also held sway in Hastings, which for a very brief time had the largest trolleybus undertaking in the world. Then came the London explosion. Things had started modestly enough with a fleet of AEC six-wheelers. Known affectionately as diddlers, these were confined to the fringes of the metropolis. Then between 1935 and 1940, twin wires sprouted everywhere, rapidly reducing tram operation to a hefty rump mainly south of the Thames. Fleet strength rose to 1,600 vehicles. Outwardly, they all had a strong family resemblance, even though there were several different types of body and chassis by both AEC and Leyland. Included were a few oddities. With four-wheel steering at the front, this chassisless Leyland dated from 1939. During the 30s, ever more life-expired tramways were condemned as inflexible and old-fashioned, whilst the in-favour electric buses were hailed as comfortable, smooth-running and noiseless. In fact, some were so quiet they were chillingly nicknamed silent deaths. Their long-term prospects appeared excellent. A three-axle vehicle could match the capacity of a tram, new extensions could be built more cheaply, and they still consumed locally produced electricity. Between the wars, most people holidayed at home, thousands migrating each summer towards the coast. By the end of the 20s, the country was crisscrossed by a vast web of long-distance coach services. To accommodate the sharers, many towns built special terminals. As fares tended to be cheaper than the train, huge crowds would cram onto every available coach during the summer months. Probably the most famous coach station was here at Victoria in London. 1928-9, this unusual Daimler, with bunks for 12, a kitchen and an Elson toilet, ran a short-lived overnight service between Liverpool and London. Throughout the 30s, time was spent struggling to fit more people into the basic single-decker box. For example, AEC produced their distinctive Q-type with its side engine behind the front axle. Some had their doors positioned forward of the leading wheels, whilst on others they were to the rear. The double-decker Q proved too expensive, so only 23 were built, the bodies being full-fronted with either front or centre entrances. Centre entrance designs found favour with some operators. At Grimsby, a few of their trolleybuses also had them, but such experiments were not generally pursued. Full-fronted centre entrance buses were, however, part of the Blackpool scene for over 30 years. Some undertakings even had buses with doors at the front and the back. And a few double-deckers sported front doors only. On many single-deckers, the door was in the forward position. Although one-man operation was forbidden on double-deckers, it was allowed on some lightly trafficked single-deck routes. This one-man Leyland Cub with its sliding front door dated from 1939 and was among the first British buses to have a rear-engine chassis. The war turned the industry on its head. Loading soared, new buses were scarce, so old buses staggered on. Rare wartime action in Salford in 1942. Services were heavily reduced as staff were transferred to transporting troops and munition workers. After dark, life was pitch black, especially in the country, where intending passengers used torches to wave down approaching buses. To help during the blackout, mudguards and other extremities were painted white. Many older people will still have clear memories of being evacuated, armed only with a gas mask and an identifying label. These scenes show children setting off to they know not where from Edgware in North London in late 1939. Two words sum up the wartime bus scene: unfrozen and utility. Unfrozen referred to buses completed by using spare parts after all regular production had ceased in 1941. Amongst the unfrozens were some ordered for export. For example, these 8-foot-wide trolleybuses destined for South Africa were allocated to London Transport. The utilities began appearing in 1941 when Guy Motors was contracted to build an austerity double-decker. Eventually, some 2,500 of these rugged machines took to the streets. They typified wartime travel, many people still remembering their unforgiving wooden seats. Both Bristol and Daimler also built utility chassis. For the single-decker market, Bedford produced nearly 3,400 OWBs. Like the utility double-deckers, they could be distinguished by their angular bodywork. After the war, Bedford reverted to making its famous OB, of which an amazing 13,000 had been built when production ceased in 1951. The chassis could accommodate a 26 or a 30-seater body. This example was owned by Banstead Coaches of Surrey. There were also utility trolleybuses. Starting in 1943, both Carrier and Sunbeam built the W model. Later, many utilities, like this Chatham and District Bristol, were rebodied. After the war, nearly everyone still relied on public transport. New, up-to-date buses were urgently needed. The vehicle at the centre of a massive modernisation programme in London was the RT. Delivery of the RT had been curtailed in 1940. Now they resumed with a vengeance. By 1954, some 4,800 of these AEC Regents had been built, making this the largest double-decker class with a single operator in the history of the industry. The design proved so successful, the last survivors did not bow out until 1979. The RTs were also supplemented by 1,600 Leyland RTLs and 500 8-foot-wide RTWs. By the mid-50s, the London double-decker fleet enjoyed a high level of standardization. Peak loadings were every manager's headache, scores of buses being needed for a handful of trips per day. A convoy of packed vehicles leaves a Manchester factory area in 1946. Reflecting years of wartime neglect, many are still sporting the city's distinctive pre-war streamline livery. There now follows a fascinating potpourri of buses in various parts of the country during the magical 50s. These were the years before the arrival of the high-capacity rear-engine vehicles which still hold sway today. The 50s were also a decade of profound change as the increasingly costly labour-intensive industry began to lose passengers by the thousands. Action here in 1951 in the West Country with a variety of Bristol Omnibus Company vehicles loading at Filton. In the northeast, a pair of United Automobile Bristols pass a Gateshead District Leyland PD2. Next, a Weyman-bodied AEC Regent. AEC Regents also abounded at Oxford Bus Station in 1952. Among them was this Bristol departing for Swindon. More glistening City of Oxford Regents grace the old university town. In Eastbourne, a Corporation Crosley DD42 is pursued by a couple of Maidstone and District Bristol Ks. Over to the Isle of Wight for a Southern Vectis Bristol L with Eastern Coachworks body. Seen at Ryde is another Bristol K-type. Here a London country area RT is followed by a Leyland Cub and a Titan. Various Bristols in Hastings. This is a Maidstone and District Bristol L. Mixing with the buses, a 1940 AEC trolleybus with a Park Royal body. At Luton, this all-Leyland PD2 is seen in 1952. It is followed by a Bristol K owned by United Counties, to whom Luton Corporation would sell out in the early 1970s. A corporation utility Bristol. Following the Leyland GNU, another Bristol utility. A brief glimpse of a pre-war United Counties Bristol. A Bristol K eases past a 1939 underfloor flat-engine Leyland Green Line coach. Two pre-war Eastern Counties Bristols roar out of Norwich bus station in 1952. Bristol was the major supplier of chassis to the Tilling group of companies. Two views of Lowestoft Corporation AEC regions with locally built ECW bodywork. After nationalisation, ECW only built bodies for the British Transport Commission. Most utilities had a short life. Most were rebodied or scrapped by the mid-50s. Admire this handsome livery on these municipal Leylands at Great Yarmouth in 1952. North now to the Manchester area in 1953. These Rochdale AEC Regal 4s have dual door bodies. Sit back now and revel in the amazing variety of operators, manufacturers and liveries. Look out for locally built Crosleys as well as Daimler, AEC and Leyland chassis. In 1953, many buses sported coronation decorations. This elderly Manchester Leyland Tiger was a survivor from the mid-30s. In the St Helens fleet were some RT-type AEC Regent 3s. In June 1953, special services were arranged in London to handle the vast coronation crowds. Note the utility Daimler, the Albion coach and the Bedford OB. Southwest now to Guildford bus station for a parade of Aldershot and District Dennises, as well as a mix of vehicles belonging to a selection of independent operators. Shortly to be withdrawn, this Leyland Cub was one of 60 one-man country area buses delivered to London Transport in 1935. 1954 begins at Southend with a Corporation Daimler and an AEC Regent. Rushden with a front-loading Birch Brothers double-decker. At Northampton, a post-war Crosley DD42 is followed by an elderly Leyland-bodied TD1 of 1931. The 50s would see off most of the country's remaining trams. Sheffield would close its last line in October 1960. Pond Street bus station with a brand new 8-foot-wide Leyland PD2. A Nottingham AEC Regent is followed by a similar vehicle from West Bridgford. Non-stop action at Mansfield bus station in 1954. Barton was one of those operators which always seemed to have a fascinating mix of old and new vehicles. These two Daimlers, one with Roberts bodywork and one with Duple, both belong to W. Gash and Sons of Newark. A rare view of an 8-foot-wide Daimler CD650 with Willowbrook body. Note the wide radiator. Following the mechanical horse and trailer, a Burton-on-Trent Guy Arab. Midland Red built many of its own chassis. This is a diesel-engined Don dating from 1935. Throughout the late 50s, increasing central area congestion was leading to calls for ring roads and more parking areas. Ultimately, many town centres would be radically altered to accommodate the motor car. This is Leicester. A Leyland PD2 belonging to the Potteries Motor Traction Company nudges past a Burlingham-bodied Leyland Royal Tiger in 1955. The PMT garage at Newcastle-under-Lyme, with some decidedly speedy action. One of the company's AEC Regals is seen in pleasant rural surroundings. In Aberdeen, a Corporation Daimler CV connects with one of the city's modern tramcars. Interestingly, Aberdeen Corporation would later become Grampian Regional Transport, which subsequently formed the basis for the present giant First Group. This Daimler has the new style of enclosed grille. An elegant Walter Alexander post-war Leyland Tiger. The trams had bowed out in Aberdeen in 1958 and in Dundee seen here 2 years earlier. This ex-Birmingham Corporation Leyland was operated by a local independent. Walter Alexander's fleet of coaches displayed an attractive bluebird motif. Inverness in 1955. David MacBrains served many rural and isolated communities in Scotland. Trams finally left Edinburgh's Princes Street in 1956. a Bristol L on the city's famous Royal Mile. Then, in procession, an AEC monocoach belonging to SMT, a Leyland Olympic, a 7'6" Daimler CV, and finally an 8-foot-wide tin-fronted Leyland PD2. This PD2 was unpainted. In an attempt to reduce maintenance costs, unpainted buses also appeared in Liverpool and London. Greater Glasgow had a terrific mix of buses. An independent is seen at Paisley Cross in 1956. Coming under the railway at Partick, a central SMT Leyland PD2. By the mid-50s, Glasgow was the only British city with trams, buses and trolleybuses. Back across the border, with a view of an East Yorkshire AEC Region 5 with Willowbrook body. These Gothic roofed vehicles were designed to squeeze under the Beverley Bar. Also edging through a Leyland PD1A with row body. Action on the coast at Hull in 1958 with an AEC Regent in the corporation's streamline livery. The following year, the decision would be taken to scrap the city's trolleybuses. A Midlands miscellany. Here a Midland Red D7 braves the bitter cold in central Birmingham. Also on view a Corporation Crosley. A West Bromwich Daimler CV. A Corporation Daimler. And a Midland Red designed 8-foot-wide D5. A Coventry Daimler CVG. A Birmingham Leyland Tiger with Metro Camel body. A Walsall PD2 with unusual full-fronted body. And finally, a charming Dennis Ace in use as a canteen. This line-up at Southport provides the perfect reminder of post-war holidays. 10 years later, this flood of Sharras would have ebbed to a trickle. The production of front-engine single-deckers ceased in the mid-50s as ever more operators ordered underfloor engine designs suitable for one-man operation. By the 60s, the industry would be facing serious challenges. Some operators had overstretched themselves buying new vehicles, car ownership was increasing, rural routes were losing money and passengers, and the first motorways had opened. More seaside delights. On a hot day, there is nothing quite like a bracing ride on an open topper. This one operated in Eastbourne. Hastings even had an open-top trolleybus. This long-withdrawn six-wheeler was restored for the 1953 coronation. Even after the wires came down, it was given a diesel engine. In Rhyl, you could ride on a Crosville Shelvoke and Drury freighter. Note the tiny wheels and vertically mounted engine. A little further along the coast, Llandudno used some Fodens with metalcraft bodies for scaling the heights of the Great Orme. To replace the nearby Llandudno and Colwyn Bay tramway, second-hand utility guys were purchased, as well as this open-top ex-Newcastle Daimler COG5. Ex-Army Bedford QLs provided a most unusual beach service in Southport throughout the 50s. The much vaunted trolleybus fell from grace almost as swiftly as the tram. Even Glasgow didn't seem wholly committed when it installed the country's last new system in 1949. Within less than 20 years, the whole thing was gone. In some quarters, the trolleys suffered the same fate as the trams. They were condemned as both inflexible and expensive. The Birmingham closure was of special significance. Here the trolleybuses, which had disappeared in 1951, would be outlived by the trams they had started replacing as early as 1922. Like many undertakings, the straggling company-owned Notts and Derby system had purchased new vehicles after the war, but these failed to stop total abandonment in 1953. Fortunately, the entire fleet was snapped up by Bradford, who swiftly developed a keen nose for a bargain. The Walsall manager, Edgley Cox, believed in the trolleybus. He introduced the country's first 30-foot-long two-axle vehicle in 1954. When these 70-seater sunbeams arrived, they had to be operated under a special Whitehall dispensation. In Pontypridd, the Urban District Council simply found the cost of upkeep and renewal too much. Again, all their remaining vehicles found new homes. Enthusiasts had flocked to Darlington to delight in the town's pre-war veterans, which kept going into the early 50s. The system packed up finally in 1957. In England, there were several examples of jointly operated routes. For example, vehicles from both St Helens and South Lancashire Transport worked to semi-interurban until 1956, both operators finally bowing out in 1958. St Helens managed to sell its modern trolleys, whilst all the SLT fleet, including some early 30s antiques, went for scrap. The company-owned Mexborough and Swinton system, which ran some joint routes with Rotherham, only ever ran single-deckers. In 1961, Atlanteans replaced these 35-seater centre-entrance sunbeams. When acquired by Bradford, they were later fitted with new double-decker bodies. When London turned its back on the trolleybus, many provincial operators felt out in the cold and followed suit. By 1962, the whole of this once vast empire had gone, conquered by the legendary Routemaster. For over 40 years, this has been the London bus. Famous the world over, these front-engine buses have starred in films and TV documentaries. For those in the industry, the RMs are acknowledged to be an excellent example of a vehicle designed by experts to tackle local traffic conditions. The RM is of integral construction, with the body and chassis combined in a single structure. It has an automatic gearbox and power steering. Of the 2,875 built between 1954 and 1968, the vast majority were standard length 64-seaters, while some 400 or so RMLs have 72-seater bodies and are 30-foot long. As the 64-seaters came on the market, hundreds were snapped up by other operators. These examples are still working in Reading. Today, the Routemaster is the last representative of the traditional British double-decker. So catch one while you can. A look now behind closed doors. Each operator has to have a well-equipped workshop to keep its buses on the road. The wheels must keep turning smoothly to bring in the revenue. Following years of wartime neglect, things were getting back to normal by the end of the 40s. Glasgow had separate facilities for its massive fleet of trams and buses. Mechanical washers removed the need to wash each vehicle by hand. Any prospective driver with London Transport had to face up to the skid patch at Chiswick. The recruits climbed in the cab, drove flat out onto a wet surface, slammed on the brakes, and then tried to control the bus as it went into a skid. All good fun when watched from a distance. Here, an STL class was being used in 1952. When Sunderland replaced its trams in October 1954, the opportunity was taken to make a film about the corporation's transport department. Included was this footage shot at Fulwell Depot. Here a bus receives an overhauled engine. Whilst another undergoes a major body overhaul. At Wallasey, views of a chassis being steam cleaned, seats retrimmed, being repainted, and running in at the end of the day. Like many other facilities, this one was demolished in the 1980s. Where does an old bus go to die? Some escape into preservation, but the vast majority end up in scrapyards. These twisted remains were filmed in a graveyard at Stratford-upon-Avon. Too worn out to find new owners, the majority of London trolleybuses were stripped of any valuable parts before the gaunt skeletons were broken up at Colindale. The trolleybus really died during the 60s. Everywhere it was buses in, trolleybuses out. In 1963, 3 more municipalities, including Portsmouth, switched off the power. These are just a handful of the towns and cities where trolleybuses were sacrificed during this electrical purge. Why did the end come so swiftly? Despite buying new vehicles in 1954, Hull stated passenger traffic had declined and new housing estates extended beyond the existing trolleybus wiring. In Nottingham, where they ran from 1927 to 1966, their demise was hastened by central area redevelopment. The last new vehicles dated from 1952. Newcastle also cited central area redevelopment, together with lack of mobility and high operational costs. Operations here had started in 1935. New vehicles were delivered up to 1950, an extension opened in 1956, but the end came just 10 years later. In Belfast, the trolleys had started replacing the trams in 1938. 20 years later, the first route was closed. By 1968, it was all over. At Huddersfield, the trolleys were very much at home, soaring effortlessly up spectacular grades. However, power costs and redevelopment led to final abandonment in July 1968. The very last trolleybuses bowed out in Bradford in March 1972. No one was building new vehicles, and the second-hand market had dried up. So the end was inevitable. Although rear-engine bus designs have dominated the past 40 years, front-engine buses were still built to the end of the 60s. These included Leyland PD2s and Bristol low-deckers, of which over 5,000 were built up to 1968. Bristol also marketed the most successful of the first generation of rear-engine single-deckers. The RE was marketed from 1962 to 1984. although those built after 1976 were solely for export. The formation from the end of the 60s of the giant passenger transport executives spelt the end for many municipal operators. A flashback to 1957, when a rich kaleidoscope of municipal colours dominated central Manchester. The 60s to the 80s would be an era of takeovers and consolidations of manufacturers, during which many famous names disappeared. Crosley, AC, Guy, Daimler, Bristol, Park Royal, to name but a few. So, what of today? Has deregulation introduced in October 1986 been successful? Certainly the industry is more profitable and leaner. It is also clearer where local authority subsidies are going. However, for the public, the overall level of service has undoubtedly declined. Now the big three, Stagecoach, Arriva and First Group, have to steer the slimmed-down industry into the 21st century. But here is the dilemma. They must also halt the decline in passenger numbers as car ownership continues to rise. As 2000 beckons, Britain's new buses are Dennis's, Volvos, DAFs, Scanias and Mercedes. Although the double-decker has survived, many of the greatest names, once the powerhouses of the British bus industry, have gone forever. Daimler, Tilling-Stevens, Burlingham, Bristol, ECW, Guy, Park Royal, Wayman, Albion, Jupil, English Electric, Crosley, Bedford, Thornycroft and MCW. Fortunately, a remarkable 5,000 old buses and trolleybuses survive through the efforts of the preservation movement. These magnificent machines of all shapes and sizes keep alive the sights and the sounds of a century of British buses and trolleybuses.